I'm standing in the same coffee shop where it all began, 3 years later, watching the steam rise from my cup like ghosts of conversations we never had. The barista behind the counter has Timothy Martinez's same dark eyes, the same careful way of moving his hands when he's concentrating. And for a moment, my heart forgets how to beat properly. It's not him, of course. Timothy is probably somewhere in California by now, chasing the dreams he whispered to me during those long summer nights when I thought what we had was temporary. Just another seasonal romance that would fade with the first autumn leaves. But here I am, still in this small Montana town, still ordering the same vanilla latte he introduced me to, still carrying the weight of words I never said. The barista asks if I want extra foam, and I almost laugh because Timothy used to tease me about my foam mustache, reaching across the table to wipe it away with his thumb, his touch lingering just a second longer than friendship required. I tell the barista no foam thank you, and find my usual table by the window where I can watch the mountains that kept me here long after I should have left. If you're watching this from your own small town, or maybe from the big city you escaped to, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And hey, if this story resonates with you, hit that hype button to help others find it. Sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us we're not alone in our complicated hearts. The mountains haven't changed, but everything else has. The coffee shop expanded, adding a bookstore section where Timothy and I used to browse poetry collections, reading lines to each other under our breath. He had this way of finding verses that seemed written specifically for moments we were living, though I was too afraid then to acknowledge what those moments meant. Now there's a display of local authors where his name should have been, if he'd stayed, if I'd been brave enough to give him a reason to stay. I came here originally for a summer internship at the environmental nonprofit downtown, fresh out of college with my ecology degree, and absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. The plan was simple: spend 3 months learning about conservation work, pad my resume, then return to Seattle where my friends were starting their careers, and my parents had already picked out neighborhoods where I should look for apartments. It was a good plan, a safe plan, the kind of plan that people like me made when they were afraid of wanting things too much. Timothy was already a permanent fixture at the nonprofit when I arrived that June, 2 years older and infinitely more comfortable with himself than I was. He'd grown up in this town, left for college in Colorado, and come back because, as he told me on my first day, sometimes you have to leave a place to understand why it's home. He was the kind of person who said things like that without sounding pretentious, who could make philosophy out of everyday observations and somehow make it feel like the most natural thing in the world. I remember the exact moment I knew I was in trouble. It was my second week, and we were out in the field measuring water quality in the streams that fed into the Yellowstone River. Timothy was showing me how to use the pH meter, standing close enough that I could smell his shampoo and the faint scent of the lavender soap he made himself. His hands covered mine as he guided the instrument into the water, and he was explaining something about alkalinity levels, but all I could focus on was the way his voice got softer when he was teaching, more intimate, like he was sharing secrets instead of scientific data. The water was cold enough to numb our fingers, but where his skin touched mine felt like it was burning. He looked up at me, probably to see if I was following his explanation, and caught me staring at his mouth instead of the meter reading. For a moment, neither of us moved. The stream kept flowing around our boots, and somewhere in the trees a woodpecker hammered out a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he was going to kiss me. Instead, he cleared his throat and stepped back, suddenly fascinated by the data sheet clipped to his clipboard. So, you'll want to record that as 7.8, he said, his voice carefully neutral. We should probably check the next site before it gets too hot. I nodded and wrote down the number, my handwriting shakier than usual. The rest of that day we maintained a careful distance, professional and friendly, but something had shifted. We both felt it, and we both pretended we didn't. That became our pattern over the following weeks. Moments of connection followed by strategic retreat, conversations that started about work and drifted toward personal territory before one of us would steer back to safer ground. The way he'd catch me looking at him during staff meetings, or how I'd find excuses to stay late when I knew he'd be the last one in the office. We orbited each other like binary stars, close enough to feel each other's gravity, but never quite touching. The town itself seemed designed for romance. All tree-lined streets and historic buildings with wide front porches where couples sat in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. There was a farmer's market every Saturday where Timothy knew everyone by name, introducing me as our summer intern with a pride that made me feel like I belonged to something. Even if I couldn't name what that something was, he'd buy peaches from Mrs. Chen and share them with me as we walked back to his truck, the juice running down our chins as we laughed about nothing and everything. His truck became another one of our safe spaces, neutral territory, where we could be ourselves without the watchful eyes of coworkers or the weight of professional boundaries. He'd drive me home after late nights at the office, taking the long way through the residential neighborhoods where sprinklers whispered across lawns and porch lights created pools of warmth in the gathering dusk. We'd sit in my driveway sometimes, engine off, talking until the windows fogged with our breath and the night settled around us like a blanket. Those conversations revealed him to me, piece by piece. How he'd majored in environmental science because he wanted to protect the places that had shaped him. How he'd dated a few people in college but never anyone seriously. Never anyone who understood why he'd choose a small town over career opportunities in bigger cities. How he made soap and grew herbs because his grandmother had taught him that creating something with your hands was a form of prayer. How he read poetry before bed because it helped quiet his mind. And how he'd started writing some of his own, though he was too shy to share it with anyone. I told him things I'd never said out loud. How I'd chosen ecology as a major partly to have an excuse to spend time outdoors, away from people and their expectations. How I'd never felt like I fit anywhere, not in my family with their corporate jobs and suburban dreams, not among my college friends with their easy confidence about the future. How I envied his certainty about belonging somewhere, even as I was starting to understand why he'd chosen this place. July melted into August with the kind of heat that made everything shimmer, including the boundaries we'd carefully constructed around ourselves. The work kept us busy, but the evenings stretched long and lazy, full of barbecues and outdoor concerts where the whole town seemed to gather. Timothy would find me in the crowd, bringing me a beer or saving me a spot on the blanket he'd spread on the grass, and we'd listen to local bands play covers of songs that reminded us both of college, of being young and uncertain and full of possibility. One evening, the band played a slow song, something acoustic and melancholy, and couples around us started dancing on the grass. Timothy stood up and extended his hand to me, not quite meeting my eyes. "Dance?" he asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made it impossible to say no. We moved together awkwardly at first, both of us hyper-aware of where our bodies touched, of how his hand felt against my back, of how perfectly I fit against his shoulder. But as the song continued, we relaxed into each other, and for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, I let myself imagine that this was real, that we were just another couple swaying under the stars, that the way he held me meant what I wanted it to mean. When the song ended, we stayed close for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His thumb traced a small circle against my spine, and I tilted my head back to look at him. His eyes were dark in the starlight, searching my face for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give him. The band started up again with something faster, and the spell broke. We stepped apart, suddenly fascinated by our shoes, by anything other than the electricity that had been crackling between us. "I should probably head home," I said, though it was barely 10 o'clock and the night was still young. "Yeah," he agreed, but neither of us moved. "I can drive you." The ride to my apartment was quiet, filled with the weight of things we weren't saying. He walked me to my door like he always did, hands shoved deep in his pockets, maintaining that careful distance that had become second nature to both of us. I fumbled with my keys, hyper-aware of him standing behind me, of the way the porch light cast our shadows together on the door. "Timothy," I started, then stopped, not sure what I wanted to say or how to say it. "I know," he said softly. "Me too." It wasn't a confession exactly, but it was the closest either of us had come to acknowledging what was happening between us. I turned around to face him, and for a moment we just looked at each other, all pretense stripped away. He reached up as if to touch my face, then caught himself, his hand falling back to his side. This is complicated, he said. It doesn't have to be, I replied, surprising myself with the words. He smiled sad and beautiful in the yellow porch light. Yes, it does. You're leaving in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The reminder hit me like cold water. In 3 weeks, my internship would be over, and I'd be back in Seattle, starting the life I'd planned before I knew places like this existed. Before I knew people like Timothy existed. The rational part of me knew he was right. Getting involved now would only make leaving harder, but standing there looking at him, the rational part of me felt very far away. Maybe I don't have to leave, I said, the words out before I could stop them. Something flickered across his face. Hope or fear, or maybe both. Don't say that unless you mean it. I might mean it. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Michael, he said, and my name in his voice sounded like a prayer, like a question, like the beginning of something I wasn't sure either of us was ready for. Before I could respond, before I could close the distance between us or step back into safety, my phone rang. The sound shattered the moment like glass, and we both jumped apart. The caller ID showed my mother's name, and I knew if I didn't answer, she'd keep calling until I did. I have to take this, I said apologetically. Timothy nodded and stepped back. I'll see you tomorrow, he said. But he lingered for a moment, as if waiting for me to choose him over the phone, over the obligations, calling me back to my old life. I answered the call and watched him walk back to his truck, his shoulders set in a way that suggested resignation. My mother's voice filled my ear, bright and cheerful, and completely oblivious to what she'd just interrupted. She wanted to know about my plans for when I got back, whether I'd had a chance to look at the job listings she'd emailed, if I'd given any more thought to graduate school. I gave her the answer she wanted to hear while watching Timothy's taillights disappear down the street, feeling like I was betraying something important with every word. The next few days passed in a haze of careful politeness and avoided glances. Timothy threw himself into work with an intensity that left little room for personal conversation, and I followed his lead, pretending that nothing had changed between us, even as everything felt different. We were professional, efficient, cordial. We were strangers who happened to know each other's coffee orders and the way each other laughed. But the town was too small for us to avoid each other completely, and our friends too observant not to notice the sudden chill between us. Emma Clark, who ran the farmer's market and had been trying to set up Timothy with someone for years, cornered me at the grocery store on Thursday evening. "What did you do to that boy?" she asked without preamble, blocking my path to the checkout line with her cart full of fresh flowers. "I didn't do anything," I said, which was technically true and completely misleading. Emma fixed me with the look she probably used on vendors who tried to pass off day-old produce as fresh. "Timothy Martinez has been moping around this town for 3 days like somebody kicked his dog, and you've been avoiding the coffee shop, which means you're avoiding him, which means something happened between you two." I stared at the wilting lettuce in my basket, wishing I could disappear. "It's complicated." "Honey," Emma said, her voice gentling, "the best things usually are." She let me pass after that, but her words followed me home. The best things usually are. I thought about Timothy's hands guiding mine in the stream, about the way he'd held me while we danced, about the look in his eyes when he'd said my name like a prayer. I thought about my apartment in Seattle that I'd never actually seen, about the job interviews I'd scheduled for the week after I got back, about the life I'd planned that suddenly felt like someone else's dream. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment from the summer, looking for signs I'd missed, for clues about what Timothy really felt. The way he'd light up when I walked into a room, how he'd remember little things I'd mentioned in passing, like my favorite kind of pie or the book I'd been meaning to read. The careful way he'd avoid touching me except when it was unavoidable, and how his fingers would linger just a second longer than necessary when they did. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went for a walk. The streets were empty except for the occasional car passing through on the highway, and the mountains stood silent and massive against the star-filled sky. Without consciously deciding to, I found myself walking toward Timothy's house, a small craftsman bungalow on the edge of town, where he lived alone with his herb garden and his poetry books. His porch light was on, and I could see warm yellow light spilling from his living room window. As I got closer, I realized he was sitting on his front steps, wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, holding a mug of something steaming. He looked up as I approached, not seeming surprised to see me. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. I shook my head and sat down beside him on the step, careful to leave space between us. "Too much thinking." "Yeah." He took a sip from his mug and stared out at the empty street. "Want some tea? It's chamomile, my grandmother's recipe." "Sure." He went inside and came back with another mug, handing it to me without our fingers touching. The tea was perfect, soothing and slightly sweet, tasting like comfort and home. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the town settling around us. "I've been thinking too," Timothy said eventually, "about what you said the other night, about maybe not leaving." My heart started beating faster. And? And I think you should go back to Seattle." The words hit me like a physical blow. I set down my mug with shaking hands, not trusting myself to hold it steady. "Oh, not because I don't want you to stay," he said quickly. "God, Michael, I want you to stay so much it's been keeping me awake at night. But you have a life there, a plan. You have opportunities waiting for you that this place can't offer. What if I don't want those opportunities anymore?" He turned to look at me then, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "What if you think you don't want them now, but you change your mind in 6 months? What if you stay for me and then realize you've given up too much? What if I leave and realize I've given up the only thing that matters?" The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Timothy reached over and took my hand, the first time he'd touched me deliberately since that night on my porch. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from working outdoors, and they fit perfectly with mine. "I can't be the reason you don't follow your dreams," he said. "What if you are my dream?" He squeezed my hand tighter, and I could see him struggling with something, some internal battle between what he wanted and what he thought was right. "Michael," he said, and there was so much longing in his voice that it made my chest ache. "I know this is crazy," I said. "I know we've only known each other for 2 months, but I've never felt like this about anyone before. I've never felt like I belonged somewhere the way I belong here, with you. You belong lots of places. You just haven't found them yet. Stop deciding what's best for me," I said, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. "Stop being so noble and self-sacrificing and just tell me what you want." He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to stay. I want to wake up next to you and make you coffee and show you all the places in these mountains that I've never shared with anyone else. I want to introduce you to my family as my boyfriend and watch you charm my nieces and nephews the way you've charmed everyone else in this town. I want to build something real with you, something that lasts." The words hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable, and more than I dared hope for. I turned on the step to face him fully, our knees bumping together. "Then let's do that," I said. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He pulled his hand away from mine and ran it through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as his tell when he was anxious. "Because what if it doesn't work? What if we try this and it falls apart and you end up resenting me for derailing your life? What if I'm not enough to make you happy here long term? What if it does work? What if we're perfect for each other and we're too scared to find out?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between hope and terror. "You really want to stay?" "I really want to stay. Your parents will think you've lost your mind. Probably. They'll get over it. Your friends will think you're having some kind of quarter-life crisis. Maybe I am. Maybe that's exactly what I need." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him in days. "You'd really give up Seattle for this? For me?" "I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing something better." Before he could argue anymore, before either of us could lose our nerve, I leaned over and kissed him. His lips were soft and tasted like chamomile and possibility, and for a moment he went completely still, as if he couldn't believe this was really happening. Then he kissed me back, his hand coming up to cup the side of my face, and it was everything I'd been imagining and more. We broke apart after a moment, both of us breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. "Are we really doing this?" he asked. "If you want to." "I want to," he said, and kissed me again, deeper this time, with a certainty that made my heart race. We stayed on his porch until the sky started to lighten in the east, talking and kissing and planning a future that felt both impossible and inevitable. He told me about the apartment above the bookstore that would be available in the fall, about the conservation projects that could use another pair of hands, about the life we could build together in this small town that had somehow become the center of my universe. When I finally walked home as the sun was coming up, I felt like a different person than the one who'd arrived here 3 months ago with a carefully planned life and no idea what he really wanted. I felt like someone who'd finally figured out how to be brave. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and difficult conversations. I called my parents first, trying to explain why I was turning down job interviews and staying in Montana with a man they'd never met. My mother cried. My father lectured me about responsibility and wasting my education. They both accused me of making decisions based on emotions rather than logic, and they weren't entirely wrong. But for the first time in my life, that felt like the right choice. My friends were more supportive, but equally confused. They'd never heard me talk about anyone the way I talked about Timothy, had never seen me so certain about something that seemed so uncertain. But they trusted me enough to believe that I knew what I was doing, even when I wasn't entirely sure myself. The hardest conversation was with my supervisor at the nonprofit, telling her I wanted to stay on permanently instead of finishing my internship and leaving as planned. She was surprised but pleased, especially when Timothy vouched for my work and my commitment to the organization. There was paperwork to fill out and logistics to figure out, but by the end of the week, it was official. I was staying. Timothy and I took things slowly at first, both of us still slightly amazed that we'd actually done it, that we'd chosen each other over all the safer options. We had our first official date at the Italian restaurant downtown, sitting across from each other at a candlelit table and trying to navigate the strange territory between friendship and romance. It was awkward and wonderful, and nothing like the easy intimacy we'd developed over the summer, but it was ours. We kissed goodnight on my doorstep like teenagers, and Timothy drove home with a grin I could see from my window. I called him as soon as I got inside just to hear his voice again, and we talked until we both fell asleep, with our phones pressed to our ears. The town embraced our relationship with the enthusiasm of people who'd been rooting for us all along. Emma Clark brought us a congratulations bouquet at the farmer's market. The barista at the coffee shop started making our drinks before we ordered them. Nancy Jones, who ran the local newspaper, asked if she could write a feature about young professionals choosing small-town life, and we politely declined but felt flattered to be asked. We settled into routines that felt both new and ancient. Timothy would pick me up for work in the mornings, and we'd stop for coffee and split a muffin while discussing the day ahead. We'd eat lunch together when our schedules allowed, taking sandwiches down to the river or finding a quiet spot in the park. Evenings were for cooking dinner together in his kitchen, learning each other's preferences and habits, figuring out how to share space and time, and the thousand small intimacies of daily life. It wasn't always easy. We had our first fight 6 weeks after I officially moved in with him, a stupid argument about whose turn it was to do dishes that escalated into something bigger about expectations and responsibilities and the fear that maybe we'd moved too fast. We didn't speak for 2 days, both of us too stubborn and scared to be the first to apologize. Finally, Timothy showed up at my office with a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself and a handwritten note that simply said, "I'm sorry. Can we try again?" We could, and we did, and we got better at it. We learned how to fight fair and make up thoroughly. We developed systems for handling stress and disagreements and the inevitable moments when one of us wondered if we'd made the right choice. We talked about everything, from childhood traumas to future dreams, from daily annoyances to deepest fears. We built trust the way you build a house, one careful piece at a time. The seasons changed and we changed with them. Fall brought brilliant colors to the mountains and the first real test of our relationship when my parents came to visit. They were polite to Timothy, but cool, clearly hoping this was a phase I'd grow out of. My mother kept mentioning job opportunities in Seattle, and my father asked pointed questions about my long-term career prospects. Timothy handled it all with grace, cooking them dinner and taking them on a tour of the conservation sites where we worked gradually winning them over with his quiet competence and obvious devotion to me. Winter was harder. The days grew short and cold, and the tourist season ended, leaving the town feeling smaller and more isolated. I struggled with moments of doubt, wondering if I'd made a mistake, if I was wasting my potential in this small place. Timothy struggled too, worried that I'd get bored or restless, that the novelty of small-town life would wear off and I'd start looking for escape routes. We talked through those doubts together, sometimes late into the night, reassuring each other and ourselves that we were building something worth the uncertainty. We made plans for spring projects and summer adventures. We talked about getting a dog, maybe buying a house together, possibly starting a family someday if we decided we wanted that. We made the future feel real and tangible, something we were creating together rather than something that was happening to us. Spring came early that year, and with it a sense of renewal and possibility. I'd been in Montana for almost a year, and the town felt like home, in a way Seattle never had. I knew the rhythms of the seasons, the personalities of the regular customers at the coffee shop, the best trails for hiking, and the perfect spots for watching sunsets. I knew Timothy's moods and habits, his dreams and fears, the way he looked when he first woke up, and the sound of his laugh when something really struck him as funny. We celebrated our first anniversary with a camping trip to the same area where we'd done water quality testing the previous summer. Timothy had packed all my favorite foods and a bottle of wine, and we spent the evening sitting by our campfire, reminiscing about how we'd met and how far we'd come. He gave me a leather journal with my initials embossed on the cover, encouraging me to write about our adventures together. I gave him a framed photograph I'd taken of him working in his garden, completely absorbed and beautiful in the golden hour light. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as we lay in our sleeping bags, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright away from even the small amount of light pollution in town. "Staying? Never. Not even when your friends post pictures of their fancy city apartments and corporate jobs?" I turned on my side to face him. "Do you regret staying here instead of moving to a bigger city?" "Never." "Then you understand." He smiled and reached for my hand, our fingers interlacing in the space between our sleeping bags. "I love you," he said, and it still gave me a little thrill to hear it, even though we'd been saying it for months. "I love you too." We made love under the stars that night, quietly and tenderly, mindful of other campers, but unable to resist the romance of the moment. Afterward, we lay tangled together, talking softly about the future we were building and the life we wanted to create. Timothy told me he'd been thinking about proposing, not immediately but someday when the time felt right. I told him I'd been thinking the same thing, that I couldn't imagine my life without him in it. The second year was easier than the first, marked by a deepening comfort and intimacy that made even ordinary moments feel special. We developed traditions and inside jokes, favorite restaurants and regular haunts. We hosted dinner parties for our friends and took weekend trips to explore other parts of Montana and Wyoming. We adopted a rescue dog named Helen Howard, a golden retriever mix who became our devoted companion and the subject of countless photos we sent to our families. I started writing seriously for the first time, inspired by the beauty of the landscape and the richness of the life we were building together. Timothy encouraged me to submit some pieces to magazines, and I was shocked when several were accepted for publication. The bylines felt like proof that I was becoming the person I was meant to be, not despite staying in this small town, but because of it. Timothy's work flourished too. He was promoted to lead coordinator for the nonprofit and started developing innovative conservation programs that attracted attention from organizations across the region. He was invited to speak at conferences and consulted on projects in other states, but he always came home to me and to the mountains that had shaped us both. We talked about marriage more seriously as our second anniversary approached. We looked at rings and discussed venues, debating between a small ceremony in town or something more elaborate for our families who would have to travel. We talked about children and career goals and where we wanted to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20. We planned and dreamed and built a future that felt solid and real and entirely our own. But life, as it tends to do, had other plans. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while we were having coffee and reading the news on our phones. Timothy's father had suffered a massive heart attack and was in intensive care in Denver. We threw clothes into a bag and drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel while the other dozed fitfully in the passenger seat. Raymond Green, Timothy's father, was a quiet man who'd worked construction his whole life and raised four children with the kind of steady love that doesn't make headlines, but forms the foundation of everything good in the world. He'd welcomed me into the family with the same quiet acceptance he'd shown everything else in his life, never making a big deal about his son's sexuality or his choice to bring home a city boy who decided to stay. He survived the heart attack, but was left weakened, facing months of recovery and the likelihood that he'd never be able to work construction again. Timothy's mother, Lauren Sanchez, was overwhelmed trying to care for him while managing her own job and the financial stress of mounting medical bills. Timothy's siblings were scattered across the country with their own families and obligations, leaving him as the obvious choice to help. We stayed in Denver for 2 weeks, Timothy sleeping in the hospital chair beside his father's bed, while I tried to be useful, bringing coffee and coordinating with doctors and handling the thousand small tasks that crisis demands. When it became clear that Raymond would need ongoing care and support, Timothy and I had a conversation that we both knew was coming, but neither of us wanted to have. "I need to move back to Denver," Timothy said. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning, exhausted and emotionally drained, sharing a piece of pie that neither of us really wanted. "At least for a while, maybe permanently." I nodded, though my heart was breaking. "I know. Come with me." The words hung between us, loaded with everything we'd built together and everything we'd have to give up. Denver was a beautiful city with plenty of opportunities for both of us, but it wasn't our small Montana town with its familiar rhythms and the life we'd so carefully constructed. It wasn't the mountains we'd hiked together or the coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation or the house we'd been planning to buy. "What about your job? The conservation projects?" "There are environmental organizations in Denver. I could find something." "What about my writing? The magazine connections I've built?" "You could write anywhere. Maybe you'd find even better opportunities in a bigger city." We were both trying to convince ourselves as much as each other, but the truth was that neither of us wanted to leave Montana. We'd found something there that we weren't sure we could recreate anywhere else. But family is family, and duty is duty. And sometimes love means sacrificing what you want for what someone else needs. We spent the next few days making lists and plans, researching apartments and job opportunities in Denver, trying to figure out how to transplant a life we'd grown in one place to soil that might not be as fertile. Timothy put in his notice at the nonprofit, and I started reaching out to contacts in Colorado, exploring possibilities that felt like consolation prizes compared to what we were leaving behind. But even as we made these practical preparations, something felt wrong. Timothy grew quieter and more distant, going through the motions of planning our move without any of the enthusiasm that had marked our other major decisions. I caught him staring out the hospital window with an expression I couldn't read, and when I asked what he was thinking, he'd just shake his head and say he was tired. The night before we were supposed to drive back to Montana to pack up our life there, Timothy's mother pulled me aside in the hospital corridor. Lauren was a small woman with Timothy's dark eyes and the kind of inner strength that comes from raising four children and staying married to the same man for 35 years. "He doesn't want to move to Denver," she said without preamble. "He wants to help you and his father." "Of course he does, but he doesn't want to live here. This isn't his home anymore." I looked through the window into Raymond's room, where Timothy was reading aloud from a book of poetry, his father's eyes closed but his breathing steady and peaceful. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that there are other ways to help family, ways that don't require him to give up the life he's built." She touched my arm gently. "The life he's built with you. But your husband needs care. Support. He needs to know his son is happy. That's what will help him heal more than anything else." Lauren left me standing in the corridor, her words echoing in my head. That night, lying in the fold-out bed beside Timothy in his childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and thought about sacrifice and duty and the different ways we show love to the people who matter to us. In the morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. While Timothy was at the hospital, I called his sister Helen Howard in Phoenix and his brother Stephen Gutierrez in Portland. I explained the situation and asked if they could help coordinate a care plan that didn't require Timothy to uproot his entire life. Helen could visit for extended periods during her summer break from teaching. Stephen could contribute financially and handle some of the long-distance coordination. Between all of them, they could ensure that Raymond and Lauren had the support they needed without any one person bearing the entire burden. It took some convincing, and it required difficult conversations about money and responsibility and the guilt that comes with living far from aging parents. But by the time Timothy returned from the hospital that evening, his siblings had agreed to a plan that would allow him to return to Montana while still being an active part of his father's care. "You did this," Timothy said after I'd explained the arrangement. We were sitting on his childhood bed, surrounded by boxes of things he'd been packing to take back to Montana, and he looked stunned. "Your family did this. I just made some phone calls. You saved our life together." He kissed me then, deep and grateful and full of relief, and I realized how scared I'd been that we were going to lose everything we'd built. That duty was going to tear apart the love we'd worked so hard to create. We drove back to Montana the next week with lighter hearts and a deeper appreciation for what we had there. The mountains looked more beautiful than ever as we crested the pass and saw our valley spread out below us. The town nestled among the trees like something from a postcard. Timothy reached over and took my hand as we drove down the familiar streets toward home. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For fighting for us, for finding a way to make it work." "We're a team," I said. "That's what teams do." We settled back into our routines. But something had changed during our time away. The crisis had tested our relationship in ways we hadn't expected, and we'd come through stronger and more committed than before. We'd learned that we could handle difficult decisions together, that we could find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, that our love was resilient enough to bend without breaking. Timothy proposed 3 months later on a hiking trail we'd discovered together during my first summer in Montana. He'd carried the ring in his backpack for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment, and when it came, it was beautifully simple. We were sitting on a rock outcropping, sharing water and trail mix and admiring the view, when he pulled out a simple gold band and asked if I wanted to spend the rest of my life exploring these mountains with him. I said yes before he'd finished the question, and we sat there for a long time afterward, holding each other and looking out at the landscape that had brought us together and would witness our future together. The ring fit perfectly, and Timothy told me later that he'd guessed my size by secretly trying on one of my other rings while I was sleeping. We planned a small wedding for the following spring, inviting just our immediate families and closest friends. The ceremony was held in the town park, under the same trees where we danced to that slow song during our first summer together. Emma Clark provided the flowers, all wildflowers and herbs from local gardens. The barista from the coffee shop, who'd become a friend over the years, played guitar and sang during the processional. My parents came, and while they still didn't entirely understand my choice to build a life in such a small place, they could see how happy I was with Timothy and how completely I'd integrated into the community. My father walked me down the aisle, and my mother cried during the vows, and afterward they both told me they were proud of me for following my heart. Timothy's family filled the other side of the small gathering, and Raymond was there in a wheelchair, still recovering but determined not to miss his son's wedding. He'd written a poem for the occasion, something about roots and wings and the courage to plant yourself where you can grow. And Timothy read it aloud during the reception, his voice breaking with emotion. We honeymooned in Yellowstone, camping and hiking and making love under the stars like we had on our first anniversary, but this time with rings on our fingers and legal documents that made our commitment official. We talked about the future with a new sense of permanence, making plans that stretched decades ahead, imagining ourselves growing old together in the town that had become our home. The years that followed were filled with the quiet joys and ordinary struggles of married life. We bought the house we'd been dreaming about, a small craftsman with a big garden where Timothy could grow his herbs and I could have a writing studio. We adopted another dog, James Chavez, a border collie mix who became Helen Howard's devoted companion and our walking alarm clock. I published my first book, a collection of essays about finding home in unexpected places, and dedicated it to Timothy and to the town that had taught me what belonging really meant. The book did well enough to attract attention from a larger publisher, and I was offered opportunities to write more, to travel and give readings and build a career that I could never have imagined when I first arrived in Montana as a nervous intern. Timothy's conservation work expanded as well. He started a nonprofit focused on protecting watersheds in the region, and his innovative approaches attracted funding from national organizations. He was invited to testify before Congress about environmental policy, and his work was featured in magazines and documentaries. But he always came home to our small town, to our house and our dogs and the life we'd built together. We talked about children more seriously as we approached our 30s, but ultimately decided that we were happy with the family we'd created. We were uncle figures to Timothy's nieces and nephews, and we mentored young people through the nonprofit and the community organizations we'd become involved with. Our house was always full of friends and visitors, and we found fulfillment in nurturing others without needing to have children of our own. The town changed around us as the years passed. Some businesses closed and others opened. Young families moved in, drawn by the same qualities that had attracted us. Old-timers passed away, and we attended their funerals and celebrated their legacies. We became old-timers ourselves, the couple that people pointed to as an example of love that lasts, of choosing each other every day over all the other possibilities life offers. Timothy's father recovered more fully than anyone expected, and he and Lauren became regular visitors to our home, spending holidays and vacations with us, becoming the grandparent figures to our dogs that they'd never gotten to be to human grandchildren. My parents visited annually, and over time they came to understand and appreciate the life we'd built, the community we'd become part of, the love that had grown deeper and stronger with each passing year. We had our challenges, of course. Money was sometimes tight, especially in the early years of building Timothy's nonprofit. We went through periods of stress and disagreement, times when the pressures of work and family and community obligations strained our relationship. But we learned how to weather those storms together, how to support each other through difficult times, how to remember what mattered most when everything else felt overwhelming. There were moments when I wondered what would have happened if I'd made different choices, if I'd gone back to Seattle as planned and built the conventional life my parents had envisioned for me. But those moments were rare and brief, usually triggered by news from old friends about promotions and achievements and milestones that looked impressive from the outside but felt hollow compared to what I had. Because what I had was Timothy, waking up beside me every morning with his hair sticking up and his eyes still soft with sleep. What I had was our dogs greeting us at the door every evening, tails wagging with pure joy at our return. What I had was a community that knew us and accepted us and celebrated our love as part of the fabric of their own lives. What I had was work that mattered and a home that felt like sanctuary and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility and promise. Now, sitting in this coffee shop 3 years after we first met, I can see our whole story reflected in the steam rising from my cup. The barista who reminded me of Timothy has been replaced by someone else, a young woman with kind eyes who knows my order and always asks about my husband. The bookstore section has expanded again, and there's a whole shelf dedicated to local authors, including my own books and a chapbook of Timothy's poetry that he finally worked up the courage to publish. The mountains outside the window are the same ones that witnessed our first conversation, our first kiss, our wedding vows, and all the ordinary moments in between that have added up to a life neither of us could have imagined when we were young and uncertain and afraid to want too much. They'll be here long after we're gone, but for now they're ours, part of the landscape of our love story, silent witnesses to the choice we made to stay, to build something together, to trust that sometimes the best adventures happen when you stop running toward the horizon and start paying attention to where you already are. Timothy will be home soon, probably with flowers from Emma Clark's stand and ideas for dinner and stories about his day that he'll share while we cook together in our kitchen. The dogs circling hopefully for dropped food and the evening light painting everything gold. We'll eat and clean up and maybe take a walk through the neighborhoods where other couples are building their own love stories, where children are growing up and dreams are taking shape and life is happening in all its messy, beautiful complexity. Later tonight, we'll lie in bed and talk about our plans for tomorrow, for next week, for the years ahead that feel both infinite and precious. Timothy will fall asleep first, like he always does, and I'll listen to his breathing and feel grateful for the choice I made all those years ago to stay, to trust, to believe that sometimes love is worth changing all your plans for. I finish my coffee and gather my things, ready to go home to the life I chose, to the man I married, to the future we're still writing together. The barista waves goodbye and tells me to say hello to Timothy, and I promise I will, already looking forward to seeing his face when I walk through our door. The mountains are still there as I drive home, eternal and beautiful, and exactly where they have always been. But everything else has changed, transformed by the simple decision to stay, to love, to build something lasting in a world that often feels temporary. I made the right choice, the brave choice, the choice that led me to exactly where I belong. And tomorrow, when Timothy wakes up beside me and asks what I want to do with our day, I'll tell him what I always tell him. Anything, as long as we do it together. Because that's what love is in the end. Not the dramatic gestures or the perfect moments, but the daily choice to stay, to build, to believe that what you have together is worth more than anything you might find apart. The summer fling that was supposed to end became the beginning of everything that matters, and I've never looked back.